Some mornings are different from all other mornings. You feel it before you open your eyes. The air is heavier. The sounds outside are muffled, as though the world itself is holding its breath. On the morning that sorrow first entered our home, I remember waking to exactly that kind of silence. A silence that was not peaceful but loaded, the way the sky turns that strange yellow-green color before a violent storm rolls in. My name is Zoe, and I grew up in a compound house at the edge of a small town in the south, where the streets were red from laterite dust and the evenings smelled of wood smoke and frying onions. Ours was not a poor family, but we were not wealthy either. We were the kind of family that worked hard, prayed every Sunday, and believed that God was watching over us with a careful and particular love. My parents had built that belief into the walls of our home, the way other people build in bricks, layer by layer, year by year, until it felt structural, permanent, impossible to remove without bringing everything else down. That morning, my uncle Femi was found dead in his bedroom. He had gone to bed the night before in perfect health, or so we thought. He had eaten dinner with the rest of the family, laughed at something my father said, washed his hands at the outdoor tap, and walked through the door of his room the way he always did, with his sandals slapping the concrete floor and his key turning once, twice in the lock. He was found at 6 a.m. by my younger sister Ada, who had gone to knock on his door to call him for morning prayers. She knocked 3 times and received no answer. She tried the handle, the door was unlocked, she pushed it open. Her scream reached every corner of the compound. I remember running out of my room still barefoot, my heart already pounding before I knew the reason. The corridor was narrow and dim, and by the time I reached Uncle Femi's doorway, my mother had already arrived and was pulling Ada back, pressing my sister's face into her chest and covering her eyes. My father pushed past both of them and went into the room. I stood in the doorway and looked past my father's shoulder. Uncle Femi was lying on his back on the bed, still dressed in the clothes he had worn the night before, his arms at his sides, his face turned slightly toward the wall. He looked almost peaceful, except that his skin had taken on a grey, waxen quality that skin only gets when the blood has stopped moving beneath it. The room smelled strange, not of death exactly, not yet, but of something that was the absence of life. A stillness that had a quality to it, almost like a sound you couldn't quite hear. My father pressed 2 fingers to Uncle Femi's neck and held them there for a long moment. Then he straightened up slowly, and when he turned around, his face was something I had never seen on my father's face before. Stripped, as though every layer of certainty he had built across his 50 years had been removed at once, leaving only the raw and bewildered face of a man who did not understand what he was looking at. "He is gone," my father said. His voice was barely above a whisper. The words hit the corridor like a stone dropped into still water, and the rings of grief spread outward immediately. My mother's wail rose before I was even aware she had drawn a breath. Neighbors from the other flats in the compound began appearing in doorways, drawn by Ada's earlier scream and now by my mother's voice. An elderly woman from the flat above us came downstairs, still tying her wrapper, took one look at my mother's face, and sank to her knees in the corridor with her hands on her head. Children who had not yet been told anything began to cry simply because the adults were crying, following some instinct deeper than understanding. I stood in the middle of all of it and felt for the first time in my life the particular quality of helplessness that comes with death. There was nothing to do, no action that would help, no words that would make any difference. Death had come into our home in the night, quiet as a shadow, and had taken my uncle without asking anyone's permission, and all the weeping in the world would not bring him back or explain why he had been taken. Uncle Femi was 41 years old. He was my father's younger brother. He had been living with us for 3 years while he saved money to build his own house. He had no known illness. He had never complained of chest pain or any difficulty of the kind. The doctor who came to certify his death would later write cardiac arrest, cause undetermined in the register, because there was no obvious explanation for why a healthy 41-year-old man would simply stop breathing in his sleep. But even as the house filled with relatives and neighbors and the sounds of mourning, something was already beginning to stir in the back of my mind. A memory that arrived uninvited and sat quietly beside all the grief. Because Uncle Femi was not the first. 3 years before, my father's oldest sister, Auntie Grace, had died in very similar circumstances. She was 53, not a young woman, but not old either, and certainly not ill. She had gone to sleep one night and had not woken up. The family had grieved and prayed and eventually moved forward, the way families do. 2 years before that, a cousin named Bola, who was only 28 and had just gotten married, had died suddenly on his way home from work one evening. His colleagues said he had complained of a headache in the afternoon, had seemed unwell, and by the time the ambulance arrived he was already gone. 3 sudden deaths, 3 people from the same family, all under circumstances that left no adequate medical explanation, and now Uncle Femi made 4. I sat in the corner of the sitting room that afternoon, watching the adults move through the familiar choreography of communal grief, the older women in a cluster near the kitchen, the men gathered in low conversation near the front door, the younger relatives running errands and carrying things and trying to be useful, and I thought about the pattern I was seeing. I was 13 years old, and I did not have the vocabulary to name what I was feeling or the framework to fully understand it. But I felt it with a clarity that was almost physical. Something was wrong. Something beyond the ordinary reach of bad luck or medical explanation was passing through our family, and each visit was leaving behind another empty chair, another name that would never again respond when called. The funeral was held 6 days later, on a Saturday that was brutally hot, the sun pressing down on the mourners like a judgment. I stood beside my father at the graveside and watched the coffin being lowered into the red earth and felt the weight of something I could not name settling over me. The pastor spoke about God's mysterious ways and the peace that surpassed understanding. And I tried to hold on to his words, tried to find comfort in them the way I had been taught to find comfort in Scripture since I was old enough to read. But as the first handful of earth was thrown onto the coffin lid with that hollow, terrible sound, what I felt was not peace. What I felt was the beginning of a question that would take me many years to find the answer to. A question that would change everything about the way I understood the world I lived in. Why did death keep coming to our door? And more frightening still, was it done with us? That night, after the guests had gone and the house had finally fallen into an exhausted quiet, I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling in the dark. My sister Ada was asleep in the bed across from mine, her breathing slow and even, unbothered by whatever was keeping me awake. I listened to the sounds of the house settling, the creak of the corrugated roof cooling in the night air, the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the street, and I felt very strongly that sleep was not coming for me tonight. The feeling that had started at the graveside had not left. It had followed me home and into the bedroom, and it sat now in the corner of the room with a weight and a presence that made the darkness seem thicker than it should have been. I was not imagining this. I was old enough to know the difference between childhood fears and something else, something that had no name in the language I had been given so far. I reached under my pillow and pulled out the small Bible my grandmother had given me on my 10th birthday, the one with my name written inside the front cover in her careful, old-fashioned handwriting. I could not see to read in the dark, but I held it anyway. It had become something of a habit of mine, holding it when I was afraid, not as a superstition, but as a kind of anchor. A reminder of something solid in the middle of whatever was shifting around me. I held the Bible and lay in the dark and thought about my uncle, and about Auntie Grace, and about Cousin Bola, and about the 4 graves in our family's history that should not have been dug as soon as they were. And somewhere between that thought and the next, without my being aware of the crossing, I fell into sleep. And the dreams began.